Thank you very much. I'd like to provide a short presentation today about what's happening in the United States with respect to environmental justice. There's a lot going on at both the federal and the state level in the United States, and I'm going to give a quick overview, particularly focused on what's happening in the Biden administration at the federal level. To begin, I think it's important to understand environmental justice, to understand some of the key terms. According to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And environmental justice focuses both on the substance, meaning what's happening on the ground, but also process. And process is a very important part of environmental justice in the United States, including hearing from communities and listening and responding to comments and concerns. There's also a big emphasis now in the United States on climate justice, which is very similar, but focuses less on contamination and pollution and more on the disproportionate impacts from climate change, including health impacts and resiliency, weather events, etc., on disadvantaged communities, including communities of color. Climate justice also refers to ensuring that the benefits of climate change, particularly investments in clean energy, are delivered to underserved communities. So I'm going to talk about how both of these concepts are being implemented right now in the United States. And to begin, I want to emphasize that environmental justice is not new. If you go back to 1994, there was an executive order from President Clinton regarding environmental justice. It was called Executive Order 12898. And that executive order provided that federal agencies would attempt to analyze environmental and health risks based on race and income and to ensure greater public participation. And even before 1994, there were efforts to address disproportionate impacts of environmental stressors on particular communities. And just one personal example, in 1995, I was a law student at NYU, and I published an article called An Environmental Justice Critique of Risk Assessment. As many of you know, risk assessment is an important tool in implementing environmental policy and determining risk associated with either a cleanup, a Superfund site, or a regulation. And I analyzed the environmental justice failings, if you will, or biases with respect to risk assessment, both in terms of failing to address multiple or cumulative exposure, as well as failing to address above average susceptibilities to contaminants. In any event, EPA has an Office of Environmental Justice. They haven't, prior to this administration, there's been a lot of programs and initiatives, but not a whole lot of action or changes in terms of how environmental justice concerns are actually addressed through the EPA programs. So if you fast forward 30 years to the Biden-Harris administration, on very close to the beginning of this administration, President Biden issued an executive order called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad. This was in January of 2021, so almost a year and a half ago. And in that executive order, President Biden said, agencies shall make achieving environmental justice part of their mission by developing programs, policies, and activities to address the disproportionately high and adverse human health, environmental, climate-related, and other cumulative impacts on disadvantaged communities. So it was very clear from the beginning, and in fact, part of the campaign of Joe Biden emphasized environmental justice concerns. So this executive order did a number of things, which I'll talk about, and then we'll look at whether or not the executive order, how the administration is progressing on some of the goals of the executive order. First of all, the executive order established two important councils or committees, if you will. One is the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, which brings forth cabinet members, the heads of a number of different agencies, really all of the key agencies in the government, to tackle environmental justice, to address environmental justice. This is what President Biden calls his whole of government approach. Secondly, the administration established what's called the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And this brings forth community leaders and other experts from across the country to advise the White House on how to address environmental justice issues. A number of other elements. There was a directive to create what's called an EJ Screen, Environmental Justice Screen Plus. And this is an interactive map that will be available on the internet to help the agencies and communities drive towards more equitable decision-making. The president also directed the EPA to strengthen environmental enforcement, particularly for violations with disproportionate impact in underserved communities. Thirdly, the president established what's called Justice 40, which directs that 40% of all the benefits of federal investments related to environmental issues be directed towards disadvantaged communities, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And also an EJ scorecard to help keep track of progress. So let's look how the administration is doing on many of these elements. In January of this year, the White House published what's called a fact sheet, quote, "A Year Advancing Environmental Justice," to detail or categorize progress advancing the environmental justice agenda. So let's look at 4 different elements: environmental enforcement, facility permitting, Justice 40, and the whole of government. So with respect to enforcement, in April of 2021, so a little over a year ago, EPA issued a memo titled Strengthening Enforcement in Communities with Environmental Justice Concerns. And that called for more facility inspections in overburdened communities and other initiatives, but was not very detailed in the specifics. In June, EPA issued another memo titled Strengthening Environmental Justice Through Criminal Enforcement, very similar, but focused on environmental crimes. And then in October of last year, EPA released a document that I think is noteworthy called its Fiscal Year 2022 to 2026 Draft Strategic Plan. And what this did was it outlined in very concrete terms some of the specific numerical objectives for addressing environmental justice. And what was interesting about this, from my perspective, as somebody who's been involved in observing the environmental justice initiatives from government for a long time, is that this strategic plan had a lot of concrete, specific goals, including, for example, ensuring that 55% of all of EPA's inspections relate to communities with environmental justice concerns. And that's just one example. There were many examples in this document that were very concrete and very specific. And then in January of 2022 of this year, EPA released a draft action plan related to environmental justice and cleaning up sites, which also outlined various measures that EPA intends to take related to contaminated sites and efforts to strengthen risk management decisions, et cetera. On environmental permitting, the administration has set as its goal to ensure that when permits are issued, that they take into account cumulative impacts of a proposed permitting decision. In other words, if you're seeking a permit for a particular facility, the agency is directed to also consider the impacts from other facilities in the area, so that when making a decision about one facility, you're considering a number of facilities in the area, even if they're not related to your particular, they're different companies and different facilities. So we've seen over the last year and a half, a number of examples concerning environmental justice and permitting. This is a case study from Houston, where, citing environmental justice concerns, the federal government told the Texas Department of Transportation to pause on a permit related to a highway improvement project. And that process is now ongoing. The reason why the EPA, or the federal government rather, required that Texas pause on the project was because there was concern about how the highway would impact over 1,300 homes, businesses, and schools, mostly impacting Black and Latinx neighborhoods. What's interesting about this particular project is that there is as you may know, right now, there's a big emphasis in the United States on improving infrastructure. And in fact, there was a bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed last year. And so you can see in this example the tension, or sometimes the conflict, between improving and increasing infrastructure and at the same time addressing environmental justice concerns. Another example, this is from an asphalt plant in Michigan, where the EPA directed the state to undertake a cumulative analysis of the projected emissions from this proposed facility. This was in September of last year. And then a third example, just last week, EPA denied an air pollution permit for a factory in Alabama near a town called Africatown, which is an interesting place in and of itself. It is a town that was founded by the descendants from the very last slave ship in the United States centuries ago, or over a century ago. And it's an area that is impacted by a number of pollution sources. The state of Alabama issued a permit. EPA, in its oversight function, denied the permit because of environmental justice concerns in the community. The state has said that it will respond to EPA's concerns and will address them. So we're still remains to be seen what happens. This is a facility that makes synthetic materials and is currently operating, but they were due to obtain a new or renewed air permit, and EPA denied it, again, citing environmental justice concerns. Now let's quickly look at Justice 40. Remember, Justice 40 is the initiative to ensure that any investment in climate or infrastructure or environmental issues, that 40% of those investments are being directed to communities that have been disadvantaged from environmental issues. In July of last year, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, issued a guidance. In that guidance, they identified 21 pilot programs for essentially experimenting with the Justice 40 requirement. These involve a wide range of programs, everything from clean water, revolving fund, to Superfund, to Diesel Emission Reduction Act, et cetera. So this is still very much in its infancy. It's in a pilot stage, but the administration is working towards implementing this objective. And then lastly, on Biden's whole of government approach, as I said earlier, there are a number of agencies that have come together in the cross-government councils to initiate a number of these objectives and to determine how each agency, through its own programs, can address environmental justice. One example, just to make it concrete, is the Department of Health and Human Services has established an Office of Climate Change and Health Equity, focused on climate change as an environmental justice issue, and particularly focused on the health impacts of climate change. So that gives you an overview of what's happening at the federal level. Another time we can talk about what's happening at the state level, but numerous states are also leading in the environmental and climate justice initiative, including California, New York, New Jersey, and many other states are looking for ways and have infrastructure and apparatus set up to both ensure enforcement is equitably addressed, as well as permitting. And with that, that's what's going on in the United States. Thank you very much.